Hello. It's working. I didn't actually plan to use a mic, so this is going to be quite interesting since part of the demo itself is some live coding. So my name's Matt. I'm based out of California. I'm here traveling right now, visiting my girlfriend and her family. That's my handle. So this talk itself, it's actually pretty related to the last talk. So we talked about code deployment, talking about microservices itself. This might be a good feature of AWS. I think I didn't get to see how many people are in AWS. Just quick raise of hands. Good, majority of people here. So quickly, I'm just going to go over the agenda of this talk. We're going to go over a brief background about myself. I'm new here. Many of you haven't met me. This is the first time. Also going to go over the use case, the problem that Lambda is actually trying to solve, and the problem that we actually ran to at work. And we all know live demos go really well, so I'm going to attempt to do a live demo with AWS here. And fourth, the most important thing for me is the lessons learned. So majority of us who are going to start looking at new technologies, it's not just a success ratio, it's most of the issues we're running into. So about me, that's Metric, and that's my dog I brought over. So if you have any questions traveling internationally with your dog, please come ask me. It was a nightmare. It's cost $5,000 one way for her, just saying. And just some employment history. So I won't go too far back into where I first started, but originally I was working out of Cisco Systems in Texas. And then after about 2 years there, I was really missing home, California. So I decided to go back, and I took a position as Director of Technical Operations at Fox Networks. It's, I don't know if they have presence over here, but News Corp, it's quite, yes, no? You do? Okay. Okay. Rupert owns everything. And then I did some traveling for the first time. In America, you don't get to travel as much, so I think it was the first time in maybe 6 or 7 years I was traveling after working. And I really enjoyed it. I actually met my girlfriend in Vietnam at the time, so I tried to find a position that would offer me some more flexibility instead of a leadership role. So now I'm working DevOps engineer, primarily doing software development, Python at Wellrock Industries. You guys probably don't know Wellrock since it's an American-based company, but have you guys heard of Kardashians? Are they popular over here, kind of? Nope, not really my consumption of media either. But we produce all their websites, all their mobile apps, and that's the company. So what problem are we trying to solve with Lambda itself? And this is my first time here, so how many of you are software developers? So around half. What about systems engineers or admins? And recruiters? All right, cool. So what problem are we actually trying to solve? So a lot of our applications, they require scheduled tasks. So the majority of you who are in AWS right now, I'm assuming first, are you Microsoft, are you Linux? But we're a Python Django shop, so we're using Celery. How many of you are familiar with Python Django? So it's a great solution once you get it up and running, but most of us have scheduled tasks that actually need to run. And this isn't something new. There's a ton of different technologies out there already. There's cron. I'm sure most of you have already set up cron, Celery, RQ, and Microsoft, I'm sure you have your own solutions as well. And who's using Lambda at the moment? Oh, great, there's quite a few actually. So this is straight from the developer guide. What is Lambda? It's a compute service where you can upload your code to AWS, and the service can run the code on behalf of your AWS infrastructure. So it's really abstracting that entire process. So right now, most of you are probably using EC2 for your systems itself. This absolutely abstracts it. I know there's a lot of movement with container services, but this absolutely eliminates any server-side infrastructure. It's frozen. Yeah. So who went to AWS reInvent this last year in Vegas? Oh, okay, only one. Well, they had a couple really great talks there, and one of the talks, and the room was completely packed, was Lambda as cron scheduling invocations in AWS Lambda. So I'm sure it's a big pain point for a lot of people here. Scheduling, if you have cron running on one particular instance, it's your golden server. You really need to make sure that system's always highly available. So what we're doing at the moment is we have an auto-scaling group, one instance running, until we looked at Lambda. And his talk was actually phenomenal. What he ended up doing was he set some triggers within AWS that would eventually invoke Lambda functions. It was great. It's kind of a hack. It's kind of a workaround. And I hope that there was an easier way to actually doing cron with AWS Lambda. End of the day, like Amazon always does, they announce support for cron, which is really great. They actually announced a ton of other stuff there that put vendors out of business. And it's kind of scary, but it was actually really cool that they ended up launching this platform. And before just picking up any particular technology and running with it, for me, I used to always do that. Oh, this looks fantastic. Let's go use that 100%. But now I have a few core principles before adopting any technology in our stack. One thing, has anybody here been waking up in the middle of the night for a production issue? It's absolutely painful, and a lot of the times, you'll find out that that exact same issue was in dev or QA or staging. So before launching any service, it's quite important for me to make sure there's a pre-production environment. Second, application logging. So historically, I've been in the front line. It's critically important to make sure that you understand what the application is doing. And monitoring notifications, not only being reactive, but proactive as well. And for the development side, it has to be easy to deploy. We need to be able to iterate very quickly. So before I go into what the company's actually using it for, I'm going to do a quick live demo. And yeah, that'd be good. Is anybody familiar with speed curve here? A little bit. For those of you who aren't, you basically put your website in, and it gives you a speed index. It'll try to load your DOM, full HTML rendering, and give you a score. So what you can do is periodically or manually trigger a test, and it'll check your website and fully render it on different platforms, Chrome, mobile devices. So part of this live demo is I'm going to actually build the application itself. We're going to deploy it. And then we'll go into the AWS console, take a look at Lambda itself, and invoke the function. So let me hop out of here. Can you guys see that all the way in the back? Is that okay? Thumbs up, thank you. So let's clean this up real quick. So if you look in this working directory, we're going to do a little Python application. It's going to interface with SpeedCurve's API. Currently, they don't have a Python library, so I wrote that in preparation for the speech. And we'll take a look at this very, very simple code itself. So one thing you need to do when you first start writing Lambda is when you invoke a function in Lambda, it's looking for something very specific. So if you're writing Node, you're looking for a specific handler that you define when you deploy your application. It's a Python application, so you should define one function. It's called Lambda handler. Let me zoom in a little bit. It's quite simple, so I put a lot of the logic in the library itself. So what effectively it does is it picks up the configuration file, meaning we don't ever commit API keys, passwords into our repo. We actually store that in S3. All this does is, based off an API key that the vendor provides us, we trigger a round of tests, and we'll go and look at SpeedCurve and see what it's actually doing behind the scenes. So again, if you look in the working directory, there's not much in here. So you might be wondering, where are all the other libraries? Where's all the dependencies? So how many of you are familiar with virtual environment in Python? Good. So we need a way to actually take all the site packages and put it in here. So I have a makefile, and we won't dig too deep into it, but we'll build our artifact itself. So what Lambda actually expects, it's a zip file. It's quite simple. Not only does it contain our main application, but you actually have to package all your site packages. So if you look in the directory now, we have a new file, deploy SpeedCurve dev. And again, what I mentioned as a best practice, you need to have separate environments. So even for Lambda, we have our function name and then our environment name. So in this case, I'm testing out in development right now. So great, we have this nice artifact. Let's get it up to AWS. So what it's doing now, it's packaging up the zip. And who's used AWS CLI before? So this is effectively a wrapper for it. So what we're going to do is we're just calling update function name. That's the one we defined. Our zip file, And then as of a few weeks ago, Amazon announced that they allow versioning now in aliases. And I'll have some resources at that towards the end. So that's it. We wrote our main application. All we did was bundle our entire site packages, and then we've uploaded it to AWS. So let's log into the console and take a quick look. So it's quite large. You want to make sure if you're writing a node, for example, and you're doing testing, or even if you are doing Python, you have different libraries in there, like Node or PyTest. You got to be careful to not bundle that in because there is a limitation on how much you have in your artifact. So here's deploy speed curve dev. We'll just click on it. And this is part of the live demo, so let's see what goes on. So I'm going to click tests. We can invoke that through the CLI, but if you're not familiar with the console itself, this is what Lambda looks like. You define your function. You could write some inline code, but we've bundled it in an artifact. So I'm going to run test. So it says successfully triggered deployment. Here's the ID. So now we'll go into speed curve, and here's a website, and we'll see if it actually worked. So great, London DevOps, it's running some checks. It's doing an API call. And hopefully this finishes in a second. I'm really crossing my fingers, making sure internet doesn't give out. So there it is. It ran a test. That might be the first one from earlier. This one might still be running. Yep, it's still running. While that's going, how are we doing on time?
Just over 12 minutes.
Any questions so far? One. Yes. So in the last couple of slides, we ran into a bunch of different limitations, and I think that's critically important before you actually transition your application into Lambda. There are a ton of different limitations. And actually last night when I was going over the slides with my girlfriend, I was saying, hey, this is limitation. And she said, are you sure you want to present on this? I don't know if it's really that good. But it's quite solid platform, but you have to definitely adhere to the limitations. That's a great question. Let's do a quick refresh. Great. So we made an API call with Lambda, and it's checking the performance of the site. It's just my blog. And that's a big thing for scheduled-based application. I mean, there's no server-side infrastructure. And let me go back to the deck itself. So what we did there was we built our artifact. We took our application. We bundled it in zip. Oh, yeah, I kind of like it. We deploy the application, and then we execute it through the console. So earlier you saw in AWS itself, the naming convention we use is function name dash environment variable. So dev, staging, or production. And as I mentioned, if you're familiar with Lambda, they just released that you can now use aliases and versioning. But for us, we bundle our credentials within the zip file. So in this case, it doesn't really matter. So the use case for our company was, who's familiar with Akamai as a CDN here? They're pretty popular. So they have a solution out there called NetStorage. So what our mobile app does is it streams live video and all the logs at 1 hour intervals goes into Akamai NetStorage. We also use a logging provider, Sumo Logic. Quick show of hands if you guys use them. Similar to Splunk, similar to log entries. It's pretty generic. And we wrote a function within AWS to effectively pull all the logs from NetStorage, commit it temporarily to the file system there, and then push the Sumo logic. To me, it doesn't really feel like you need servers to actually do that. You could actually do it in memory. So this, for us, was a good use case. But back to your question, we ran into a ton of different limitations and things I wish I knew before digging into Lambda. First thing is language support. So for my philosophy was write everything locally first, and it should work in AWS Lambda. There should be no reason why. Second is the limitations. So when we started this Node application, started writing everything locally, we were going to run it on EZ2, and we were just going to transfer it over to Lambda. Simple example code in Node if you write it. Built-in library, path, simple parse function, and as soon as we pushed it onto Lambda, everything blew up. Object has no method parse. And I was really confused, and I had to dig through it. Wasn't sure why I was working locally, but not in Lambda. Well, I was developing in 4.0, their most recent version, and their support is only 0.1036. Mind you, they do skip revision, so it went from 10.36 all the way to 4. Java 8, and Python 2.7. So if you're running 3.0, 3.5, something in Python, something to consider is backwards compatibility. They don't offer it at the moment. So we effectively ran to every limitation that they had, and I wish I looked into it before. So ephemeral disk capacity. Normal application, we're pulling logs in, the application directory, saving it to disk, uploading it over to Sumo Logic. Well, as soon as we started running the function, it stopped. It said, you don't have access. So looks like AWS Lambda, you only have access to your temp directory. So keep that in mind when you're writing your application. Number 2, number of file descriptors. They have a limitation of 1,024. So what does our service do? We're grabbing a bunch of log files, lots of tiny little ones, and pushing it over to the cloud. That broke immediately as well because there's definitely more than 1,000 log files. So what we had to do was limit every function call to around 200-300 files. And one big thing for us too was maximum execution duration per request. Pushing the logs takes around 60 seconds, depending on how big the log files are. So if you're looking for larger background processes, there is a limitation of 5 minutes at the moment, so keep that in mind. And for me, coming from system side, it's very, very important to separate out our different environments. So what we're currently doing is we're storing our credential files in S3 as part of the build process. We're pulling down the correct environment variables, and then we're building the artifact and pushing it up. So dev, QA, staging, production, always separate. And it's kind of risky, but I looked at our bill. AWS could be quite expensive. But looking at our Lambda costs, we're running the function every 5 minutes. It's not that much. So if you look at the free tier, which is 1 million requests, we'll run out in about 9 years, which is quite nice. But as logs get increasingly big, we'll end up using more of their bandwidth, and we'll keep a close eye on it for sure. So some key takeaways before you jump into Lambda. Your application has to treat your file system as ephemeral. A lot of people, when they write their application, you're already doing that, right? So making sure that if you're auto-scaling, it's going to clean up after itself. You really have to focus on that. So when you write your function, you're writing temporary files or you're doing some caching, even if an exception gets raised, you have to clean up after yourself, because the next time the function runs, you might get that container again, or you might leave something on that file system that your next function is going to pick up. So treat your application and your file system as ephemeral. And I wish I'd done this from the very beginning. If not, I wouldn't have to go back and refactor a ton of legacy code. Really make sure what versions are compatible. I think AWS is probably going to announce they're supporting some additional languages soon. And I'll make this publicly available, probably share it with you guys, some really good resources. That's Metric again. And that's my email and GitHub and Twitter. We have about 1 minute left. Any questions?
You said that the instance is ephemeral,
Mm-hmm.
but then you said you might get the same instance. But is that not?
So,
Is it ephemeral?
so-
Would that be clean?
So what we ended up seeing was, and AWS did say it, I think it's container backed. So when you instantiate or create your function itself, for that function, it may, on the first execution it runs, 5th execution, it might get that container again, it might not. So for people who have caching strategies, they can potentially put stuff on there, but you don't guarantee you're going to get the same container every time. So I wouldn't have my application logic depending on what's on the file system for every run, because you might get container number 2 the first run, container number 10. So you just have to treat it as if you're not going to get the same instance every time, underlying file system. Another question.
Is there an infosec issue around that? Is that data available to other users?
No, so from what they said is when you create your function, only your function has access to the underlying container. I would hope that's true, but I'll leave that up to AWS for that. Yeah, that would definitely be a concern if people somehow pick up your container itself. That's a good question. Yep, definitely clean up. And one more question. I think we have time for one more. Unfortunately, so the way we're throttling it right now is the number of log files per function invocation. I'm sure that if we were making more API calls, we'd definitely run into that. Right now, we're hitting one endpoint. So for me, I haven't really ran into that. But I would think you'd have to throttle in your application too, and it's not the best solution. And I'm sure we'll eventually run into that as well. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.